I want to talk to you for a few minutes about evidence and images in particular. Um, Images, I love images in teaching and in research, but for teaching, they're really effective ways to illustrate things that are going on. And you've seen in our video lectures that I use lots of images. I love those images. I think they're really quite beautiful, quite evocative, and quite interesting. Um, but they're often misleading too, or at least problematic. This is particularly the case for indigenous people, because indigenous people in North America were not literate people. They don't we don't have written records by indigenous people to work on. So therefore we rely almost completely on the writings of the settler colonizers to understand that history. And that's problematic because it means we're always seeing indigenous people through the eyes of the colonizer, not of the colonized. So it's a limited perspective. This is as much true as it is for textual documents as it is for illustrations of indigenous people. We have some indigenous art from the colonial period, but not a lot. We have a lot of paintings of indigenous peoples. I'm going to show you a couple of images here of, and these are quotation marks here, Indian villages, made over the span of almost 140 years. And what you'll see is a remarkable similarity in their composition. And I should stress, these are not obscure. These are showing up in significant maps and illustrations in books from the early modern period. In 1585, John White, a colonist at the failed Roanoke colony in what is modern-day Virginia, sketched a watercolor of an Algonquian village called Pomioc, just on the eastern shore of modern-day Virginia. You can see it's a village of long houses, a bit like the Iroquoian style that we've seen in the past. You can see that there is a fence around it, a kind of protective barrier around it. And you can see in the lower left there's a kind of gateway, entranceway. That'll be useful for us as a kind of marker with other illustrations. This one's round, and you see in other illustrations it varies a bit, but the basic form of what's going on is pretty much established in this one. You can also see that fire in the center with people sitting around, and it's hard to tell in this version what they're doing. I can tell you there's another version where we can see a much closer up version of that, and it's a feast of some sort. They're cooking something, but it's a kind of feast going on, and they're all sitting around the pot together. So this is 1585, John White. John White returns to Britain. No, sorry, it wasn't Britain, it was England at this time, but he returns to England in 1586, where his sketches were used by a Dutch engraver by the name of Theodore de Bry to illustrate an Englishman's book about life in Virginia, which gets published in 1590. And you can see in this illustration that the relationship is really quite close. The buildings are almost exactly the same. There's that little gate, the fence around the outside, there's that little gate in the lower left-hand corner. You can see the people sitting around the fire, the feast is going on. This is a pretty close copy of White's original drawing, and this is an engraving based on that. A near identical version shows up in a detail on a 1632 map. So now we're, almost 50 years later, in William Blau's map of New Amsterdam, modern-day New York. You can see, in fact, on the map it says New Amsterdam there along the left-hand side. But you can see this is just a detail in a larger map. It's a much larger map, a tiny little detail in there. But you can certainly see that this is modeled on the White de Bry piece earlier, right down to, we don't have the little fire in the center, but we certainly have the house. We certainly have the houses, rather the long houses, right down to the gate in the lower left-hand corner. So there's certainly a basic similarity there for sure. A century later, well, a century after de Bry, 70 years, 50, 60 years after William Blau, another Dutch cartographer, Nicholas Vischer, borrowed from de Bry's version, decorating the margin of his map with an illustration where he placed the Sasquatch people. And you can see the illustration is almost identical. And you can see the two illustrations of the Armeniacs, a larger group of people who are Seneca people, above them. But again, the same basic organization of long houses surrounded by fences. And again, the similarity is really quite remarkable in these. And then finally, 35 years after all of this, the English cartographer Herman Mall borrowed the same image to illustrate his new map of the northern parts of America in 1720. This village is now called an Iroquoian village, but you can see it's clearly based on the White de Bry model from 100 years earlier, 150 years earlier. It's meant to be an Iroquoian village. It kind of looks like an Iroquoian village because we know Iroquoian people lived in long houses and surrounded themselves by gates like this. But his model is not Iroquoian cultural descriptions or physical descriptions. It's really the drawings that he's seen in the past. And again, that's really, really important because it points to the role of reproduction, copying, and in fact plagiarism in many ways, just kind of ripping things off, in historical production at the time. This is about how maps and books were being produced at the time. These people didn't journey to the New World. They went to an existing source and they borrowed it, lifted it, they put it in their version. To the extent that what becomes clear is that these versions are as much simple plagiarisms, as much simple facsimiles of each other, as they are accurate illustrations of something on the ground. These illustrations get used a lot. Those illustrations that I've just shown you, many of them show up in textbooks fairly routinely to show us what, quote, Indian, end quote, life looked like in the past. These illustrations allow us to see things in the past. The question is, if it's just a recycled image, though, what are we really seeing? Is this really an image of an indigenous village? Or is it really just a kind of recycled product of one man's view from one illustration from the time period? It might be a great illustration. It might be a terrible illustration. But it's certainly the most common illustration. And in short of other evidence, it's hard to say it's in any way authoritative. Let's look at a couple of other examples. These are paintings representing the Mi'kmaq people of modern-day Nova Scotia in the early 19th century. Look at these two paintings. They're virtually identical compositions. Look in particular at the group of people in front of the wigwam on the right-hand side, the man carrying the canoe up, the kind of general layout of water in the background followed by a hill. But they're not the same. They are painted 20 years apart, and one is situated in Quebec City on the Lévis side, the south side of the river, and one is situated on Halifax, again, not in Halifax, but on the Dartmouth side, on the other side of the harbour. But you're looking at Halifax in the distance, you're looking at Montreal in the distance, but the foreground is pretty much identical. Here's another painting. You've seen this before. We saw this in an earlier lecture. This is by William Wager. It's in the Nova Scotia archives. It's more or less the exact same composition. Man hauling the canoe out of the water. It's a river this time. It's an estuary. But there's that family group again in front of the wigwams. They're engaged in the exact same poses, apparently having the exact same conversations as the people who were in Quebec City 30 years earlier. So again, we don't know how these things got painted, but clearly there's some copying going on. And so therefore the connection to real people, real indigenous peoples, seems slim. Here's another one. Look at this. Another one. This one's 20 years apart. This one is William Beestall from 1807. Again, a nearly identical composition. You could say that the one on the left is better than the one on the right, but in terms of composition, in terms of the factual content of what we see in these pictures, pretty much identical. So as an illustration of indigenous life, they are pretty much identical. Here's an illustration from a book, William Morson's Letters from Nova Scotia, published in 1829. It's the exact same people. It's the exact same river. It's the exact same canoes. It's the exact same composition of the painting. Everything is exactly the same. Harder to see in this one, admittedly, but you certainly get the idea. This appears to be the original. It's a painting from 1790 by a man by the name of Herbert Binney. Sorry, we don't actually have the Binney one here. We have his later painting of it, but he did a watercolor of this painting. He copied his own painting, and it dates from the 1790s. So this appears to be the original composition. And this is a man who was the collector of customs in Halifax in the late 18th and early 19th century. He lived in Nova Scotia. A lot of these other people were military officers passing through, so possibly that explains something. But again, we don't really know if Herbert Binney went out to a village on the shores of a river in Nova Scotia to paint these people. Maybe he's basing this on somebody else's illustration that we don't have a copy of. We don't really know. and it may well be entirely a product of his imagination. He certainly has some things right. The hat, for example, of the woman in the foreground, that is a traditional Mi'kmaq female headdress, and the woman in front of the canoe is wearing a similar attire. And in general, they seem to be dressed appropriately for Mi'kmaq people. We know that because we have photographs of people, not from this time period, but from a very slightly later period, from the 1850s and 60s, where they're wearing identical things. We certainly have museum collections that have articles of clothing that look just like this. So he's got that right. But he would have seen that in Halifax in this time period. Mi'kmaq people are showing up as traders in Halifax all the time. So it's entirely possible, perhaps even likely, that he's imagining these people in this kind of forest, river, woodland setting. He draws a crude wigwam. He shows their canoes. He shows them coming back from hunting. He shows people that he's seen, but not really in this setting. Again, we don't really know what we're looking at. 6 images, 4 decades apart, with the same basic composition, and all with the exact same cluster of figures. 6 copies, same composition. So what do such examples tell us about the authenticity of what we see in historical illustrations? It really forces us to acknowledge that what we're seeing may not be accurate. It might be accurate, and certainly aspects of it are accurate. And is it still a useful illustration of these people? Well, yes, I used it for you earlier in the term. But as a factual accounting of people's lives, we do have to acknowledge that there may be problems with these sources.